A young royal guard shows heartwarming respect to elderly veteran. For 75 years, his medals had told tales of unimaginable courage, Normandy, Korea, battles that shaped history itself. But now, standing before Buckingham Palace, decorated, where hero James Harrison fought his hardest battle yet, against his own failing body, against time itself. As his legs began to buckle, as years of old wounds threatened to bring this proud warrior to his knees, young Guard Thomas Bennett witnessed something tourists couldn't see. A living legend about to fall. 3 combat tours had taught Bennett when rules must yield to honor. In one heart-stopping moment, as an old soldier's dignity hung by a thread, centuries of tradition clashed with the deepest code of military brotherhood. What happened next left hardened veterans in tears and changed how the world sees true respect. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I've got something really special for you. And now, back to the video. The morning sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace's courtyard as Guard Thomas Bennett stood his post, every inch the perfect soldier in his ceremonial uniform. Through 3 tours in Afghanistan, he'd learned to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing. That's why he alone saw what others missed. The old warrior appeared at the edge of the tourist crowd, his bearing unmistakably military despite his 90 years. His medals, so many they seemed to weigh down his jacket, caught the morning light, each one whispering stories of battles that had shaped history itself. Normandy, Korea, conflicts that had forged the world Bennett now guarded. James Harrison had once stood as straight as any palace guard. Now he leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane, his knuckles white with effort as he fought against time and gravity. But his eyes, those were unchanged, carrying the same steel that had once stared down Nazi tanks across French fields. Bennett's peripheral vision caught every detail that tourists missed. The slight tremor in Harrison's hands, not from fear, this man had faced too much to fear anything now, but from the weight of years and old wounds that never truly healed. The way his right leg dragged slightly, testament to shrapnel taken, while saving his entire unit. The proud tilt of his chin as he refused to let age diminish his soldier's bearing. "Grandpa, look at the guard." A young boy pointed at Bennett, tugging his grandfather's sleeve. "He doesn't move at all." Harrison smiled down at the child, though the movement cost him precious balance. "That's right, son. Just like we did, back in my day. Standing guard, over what matters most." His voice carried the gravel of command, though softer now with age. Bennett maintained his forward gaze, but his trained eye caught the moment Harrison's legs began to betray him. A slight wobble, a sharp intake of breath. The cane sliding slightly on ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by countless tourists. Other visitors streamed past, snapping photos, pointing at Bennett's ceremonial splendor, completely unaware of the real hero struggling silently in their midst. A group of teenagers jostled past Harrison, nearly knocking him off balance. The old soldier caught himself, but Bennett saw the cost in his face, pride warring with pain, dignity battling against failing strength. "Used to be able to stand guard for hours," Harrison muttered, more to himself than the crowd. "Now can't. Even—" His voice trailed off as his right leg buckled slightly. The medals clinked softly against each other, a sound like distant battle bells. Bennett's ceremonial stance never wavered, but beneath his perfect stillness, every combat-trained instinct screamed warning. He recognized the signs. A proud warrior, fighting his final battle, not against enemies he could see, but against time itself. And this was one battle the old soldier was about to lose. Harrison's legs trembled more noticeably now, each moment of standing becoming its own private battle. His grip tightened on the cane until his knuckles showed white against the polished wood, but his face remained proud, determined not to show weakness in front of Buckingham Palace, where he'd once stood guard himself. "Just a bit longer," he whispered to himself, words carried on shaking breath. "Stand fast, soldier, stand fast." The same words he'd spoken to his men in frozen Korean hills, in French fields swept by German fire. But this time, his own body was the enemy he couldn't defeat. Other veterans in the crowd began to notice. They recognized the signs, saw the struggle behind the proud facade. An elderly man wearing a Royal Marines beret touched his wife's arm, nodding toward Harrison. "Mary, that's James Harrison. D-Day, first wave. Saved his entire platoon." Bennett's peripheral vision caught every detail of Harrison's growing distress. The slight sway in his stance, the way his breathing had become more labored, the tremor that ran through his medal-decorated chest as he fought to remain upright. Each medal told its own story of courage, and now their bearer was fighting perhaps his hardest battle, against the indignity of falling in front of tourists who didn't understand. "Grandpa?" The young boy tugged at Harrison's sleeve, concern creeping into his voice. "Maybe we should sit down for a bit?" "No, Thomas," Harrison replied, his voice steady, even as his legs threatened to fail. "Your grandmother's coming to meet us here. Want her to see me standing tall like when we first met. I was a guard here then, straight as an arrow." His words trailed off as another wave of weakness washed over him. Bennett saw what the tourists couldn't, the combat-seasoned signals of a man about to fall. He'd seen those same signs in Afghanistan, when wounded comrades tried to walk to medevac helicopters on sheer willpower. Harrison's right leg was barely supporting weight now, and his left wasn't far behind. "Used to stand guard for 8 hours straight," Harrison murmured, pride mixing with pain in his voice. "Rain, snow, didn't matter. Never moved an inch. Now can't even—" A sharp gasp cut off his words as his right knee buckled slightly. The other veterans had begun moving closer, forming an unofficial honor guard around their struggling comrade. They understood what the tourists couldn't, that they were witnessing not just an old man's physical weakness, but a warrior's last stand against time itself. Bennett remained motionless at his post, but every combat-trained nerve screamed at him to act. Through his ceremonial stillness, he saw Harrison's cane slip slightly on the smooth stones, saw the proud old soldier's balance waver. In that moment, as an old warrior's dignity hung by a thread, Bennett faced the choice that would shatter protocol but fulfill its deepest meaning. It happened in slow motion. Harrison's cane slipped on the ancient cobblestones, worn smooth by countless tourists. His legs, which had carried him through the bloodiest battles of the last century, finally betrayed him. The proudest of warriors was about to fall. "No," the old soldier whispered, more prayer than protest. His medals clinked softly as he swayed, each one seeming to cry out for the dignity of their bearer. His grandson reached for him, but was too far away to help. In that frozen moment, Bennett saw more than just an old man falling. Through his ceremonial stance, he witnessed 75 years of service about to end in humiliation on cold stones. D-Day Korea, battles that had shaped the very freedom Bennett now guarded, all about to end with their hero face down before uncaring tourists. The palace guard sergeant was approaching, already seeing the situation unfold, but he was too far away, and protocol demanded Bennett maintain his post. 15 years of guard. Duty had trained him never to move, but 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him something else, that sometimes the highest duty transcends all rules. Bennett moved. Not the ceremonial movements tourists came to photograph, but the fluid grace of a combat veteran who had carried wounded comrades under fire. His white gloves flashed in the morning sun as he crossed the space between his post and Harrison in 3 perfect strides. He caught the old warrior before he could fall, one arm supporting Harrison's weight while the other maintained perfect control of his ceremonial rifle. The movement was so precise, so disciplined, that several tourists thought it must be part of some ceremony. "Stand easy, sir," Bennett spoke softly, his voice carrying the respect of one soldier to another. "I've got you." His white gloves, symbol of ceremonial perfection, now supported a hero who had once stood where Bennett stood. Harrison's eyes met his, soldier to soldier, spanning generations of service. "Breaking protocol, son," he managed, even as he leaned gratefully into the support. "They'll have your stripes for this." "No, sir," Bennett replied, his bearing parade ground perfect even as he supported the veteran's weight. "Just following a higher protocol. No brother-in-arms falls while I stand guard." The other veterans in the crowd understood first. The Royal Marine removed his beret. A former RAF pilot saluted. One by one, military men and women present recognized what they were witnessing. Not a breach of ceremony, but its deepest fulfillment. The palace guard sergeant had arrived, taking in the scene with professional assessment. But instead of reprimanding Bennett, he saluted. "Carry on, Guard Bennett," he said quietly. "Some duties supersede all others." Tourists had stopped taking photos, sensing they were witnessing something profound. Parents whispered explanations to their children about respect, about service, about the bonds that bind soldiers across time itself. "Got a chair for Mr. Harrison, sir?" A palisade appeared, moving with quiet efficiency. But Harrison shook his head, his soldier's pride still burning bright despite his failing strength. "If it's all the same," he said, his voice stronger. "Now with Bennett's support, I'd like to stand. One last time where I used to stand guard myself." His eyes met Bennett's, carrying memories of when he too wore the ceremonial uniform. "Just need a moment to remember." Bennett adjusted his stance slightly, providing perfect support while maintaining his military bearing. To tourists, it might have looked like two men simply standing close, but other veterans saw the precise way Bennett had positioned himself. Combat techniques adapted to ceremonial duty, strength offered without diminishing dignity. "You know," Harrison spoke softly, his voice meant only for Bennett. "Stood right here in 52, Queen's Guard, just like you. Never thought I'd need help standing on these stones." His medals caught the sunlight, each one telling its own story of courage and sacrifice. "Sir," Bennett replied, his voice equally low. "Some of us still remember what these stones cost. What your generation paid so we could stand here." His white gloves, symbol of ceremonial perfection, now served a higher purpose, supporting a hero who had paved the way for all who followed. The palace guard sergeant had quietly reorganized the tourist barriers, creating a space of dignity around the two soldiers. Other guards adjusted their positions subtly, their ceremonial precision now forming an honor guard for an old warrior's moment of remembrance. Harrison's grandson watched with tears in his eyes, understanding for the first time what his grandfather's medals truly meant. "Dad," he whispered to his father, "is this why Grandpa never talks about his service? Because it means so much?" The old soldier's breathing had steadied, supported by Bennett's unwavering strength. His hand, no longer trembling, rose slowly to his chest, touching medals that had been earned in humanity's darkest hours. "Used to be able to stand here all day," Harrison murmured, but there was no bitterness in his voice now, only remembrance, guarding not just a palace but everything we fought for, everything we... His voice caught slightly. "Everything we lost friends for." Bennett maintained his ceremonial bearing, but his response carried the weight of understanding. "We still guard those things, sir. Their names, their sacrifice, their honor. It's all here in every stone, in every step we take." The morning sun rose higher over palace walls that had witnessed centuries of service. But perhaps never before had they seen such a moment, where tradition yielded to honor, where ceremony bowed to the deeper meaning it was meant to protect. Word of what was happening spread through the palace grounds in reverent whispers. Tourists who had come for photos found themselves witnessing something far more profound. Parents lifted children onto shoulders, quietly explaining the significance of what they were seeing. "Look at their bearing," the Royal Marine veteran told his grandchildren, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect ceremonial stance, both of them. The young guard hasn't broken discipline, he's elevated it to its highest meaning." The palace guard sergeant had received word from command through his earpiece. Their response was immediate and unprecedented. "Guard Bennett is to be commended. His actions represent the finest traditions of the service." Harrison's wife had arrived, stopping short at the sight before her. Tears filled her eyes as she watched her husband standing tall again, supported by a young guard who seemed to understand exactly what this moment meant. She'd seen that look in her husband's eyes before, on their wedding day, when he'd stood in his own guard uniform. "Mary," Harrison called to her, his voice stronger now. "Come see where I used to stand, where this young man helped an old soldier remember what it meant." His medals gleamed in the sunlight, but it was the pride in his eyes that truly shone. Bennett maintained his perfect posture, but his voice carried gentle understanding. "Mrs. Harrison, your husband once stood guard over everything we hold dear. Today, it's my honor to stand guard with him." A group of schoolchildren on a palace tour fell silent, their teacher seizing the moment for a lesson more valuable than any textbook. This, she told them softly, is what respect really looks like. Not just ceremonies and uniforms, but understanding what they truly mean. Harrison's grandson had moved closer, studying both men with new understanding. "Grandpa," he asked, "is this why you always stand so straight when they play the anthem, because of days like the ones your medals remember?" The old soldier's hand touched his decorations, each one a story of courage and loss. "These medals," he replied, his voice steady now, "they're not just for what we did, son. They're for the ones who never came home. The ones this young man still stands guard over, same as we did." Bennett felt the weight of those words, understanding that he was holding up more than just an aging veteran. He was supporting the living embodiment of sacrifices that had made his own service possible. The morning sun traced shadows across the palace stones, but they seemed different now. Each one felt like a page of history, each one carrying the footsteps of guards who had stood watch through Britain's darkest hours and finest moments. "Tell me, son." Harrison spoke softly, his voice meant only for Bennett. "Where did you serve before this post?" Though still supported by the young guard's strength, his dignity had fully returned, allowing him to speak soldier to soldier. "Afghanistan, sir, 3 tours." Bennett's response carried the same quiet tone. "But standing here, holding up a D-Day veteran, this means more than any combat patrol." Harrison nodded slightly, understanding the deeper meaning. "Kandahar?" he asked, recognizing something in the young guard's bearing that spoke of hard-earned experience. "Yes, sir. Royal Marines. Lost some good men there." Bennett's voice carried the weight of memories that only another soldier could understand. "But standing here with you, sir, helps me remember why they made those sacrifices." The old soldier's hand moved to one particular medal, the Distinguished Service Cross he'd earned on Normandy's beaches. "We lost good men too. Every generation does. That's why what you're doing now matters so much. Not just helping an old man stand, you're helping keep their memory standing too." A palace photographer had captured the moment, understanding its historical significance. The image would later hang in the guardroom, 2 soldiers from different eras, perfect in ceremonial bearing, one supporting the other, while both maintained the dignity of their service. "Your generation," Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger with pride, "you carry on what we started. Not just the traditions, but the understanding of what they mean, why they matter." Bennett's white gloves remained steady, his support unwavering. "We learned from your example, sir. Everything we do is built on the foundation your generation laid. In blood and courage." The palace guard sergeant had quietly arranged for other guards to adjust their posts, creating an informal honor guard around the 2 men. Each guard understood they were witnessing something that transcended normal ceremony. "When I first stood post here," Harrison shared, his eyes distant with memory, "I thought it was all about the ceremony, the perfect stance, the precise movements." He paused, looking at Bennett's supportive stance. "Took combat to teach me it's about something deeper, something you clearly understand." Mary Harrison watched her husband with tears of pride, seeing him stand tall again in the place where they'd first met. She remembered him in his own guard uniform, young and straight as an arrow. Now she saw that same spirit, supported by a new generation that understood the true meaning of respect. "Your unit lost men?" Harrison asked gently, recognizing the look in Bennett's eyes. The same look he'd carried home from his own wars. "Yes, sir, good men, best I've known." Bennett's response carried the weight of battles fought far from these peaceful palace grounds. Standing guard here helps honor their sacrifice, helps remember what they protected. Around them, tourists had stopped taking photos, sensing they were witnessing something too profound for casual pictures. Parents drew their children closer, trying to explain the depth of what they were seeing, not just 2 soldiers standing together, but a living bridge between generations of service. A young palace guide had stopped her tour group, seizing the moment for a lesson no guidebook could teach. "What you're seeing," she explained softly, "isn't a breach of protocol. It's the deepest fulfillment of what these guards represent." The king himself had been informed of the situation. His response, delivered through command channels, was immediate. This is exactly what we mean by the finest traditions of service. Guard Bennett is to be commended not just for his actions, but for understanding what truly matters. You know what this reminds me of? Harrison spoke, his voice carrying strength now despite his physical weakness. Normandy, not the fighting, though God knows I'll never forget that, but the moments after, the way we held each other up, kept each other standing when we had nothing left. Bennett's response was quiet, but filled with understanding. Afghanistan was like that too, sir. Not the battles themselves, but the moments between. When staying upright was an act of defiance, when holding a brother up meant everything. Mary Harrison had moved closer, her hand finding her husband's arm. "James," she whispered, "you're standing exactly where you stood the day we met, when you were the young guard, straight and proud in your uniform." The old soldier smiled, memories flooding back. "That's right. Caught sight of you walking past, nearly broke protocol myself that day." He glanced at Bennett, though not as nobly as this young man has. Other veterans in the crowd had begun, sharing quiet stories with those around them. Tales of moments when protocol met humanity, when service transcended ceremony. Each story added depth to the scene unfolding before them. "Dad," Harrison's grandson asked, "can I stand guard too someday, like Grandpa did, like this guard is doing?" The question brought fresh tears to Mary's eyes. She saw in the boy's face the same look her husband had worn in his youth, that mix of pride and determination that marked true service. Bennett maintained his perfect bearing, but his voice carried gentle wisdom. "It's not just about standing still, son. It's about understanding what we stand for. Your grandfather taught my generation that. We're still learning from his example." The palace guard sergeant had received another message through his earpiece. The king had requested the photograph of this moment be given a place of honor in the guard room. "So future guards will understand what their duty truly means," the message read. Throughout it all, Bennett's support never wavered. His ceremonial precision remained perfect, but now it served something greater than ceremony. It upheld the dignity of a warrior who had paved the way for all who followed. Word of what was happening spread through military channels faster than any social media could match. Veterans from nearby London regiments began arriving quietly, forming an unofficial honor guard around the scene. Each understood they were witnessing something that transcended ordinary ceremony. "3 tours in Afghanistan," the Royal Marine veteran whispered to those nearby. "And this young guard sees what matters most, holding up the heroes who held the line before us." Harrison's medals caught the morning sun, each one telling its story to those who knew how to read them. The Distinguished Service Cross from Normandy, the Career Service Medal. Campaign ribbons that trace the history of freedom itself. "You've got quite a weight of history there, sir," Bennett said softly, noting how Harrison's hand kept returning to the Normandy medal. "Must have been one hell of a day." "June 6, 1944, Harrison replied, his voice distant with memory. "Lost. My best friend on that beach, Tommy Collins. Every time I stand here, every time I see these palace stones, I think of him. Of all of them." Bennett's support remained steady, but his response carried deep understanding. "We think of them too, sir. In Afghanistan, when things were worst, we'd tell stories about your generation, about what real courage looked like." A group of active duty soldiers on leave had joined the gathering crowd. They stood in perfect attention, understanding that they were watching a masterclass in what service truly meant. "Your grandson asked about becoming a guard," Bennett said, noting how the boy hadn't taken his eyes off either of them. "He's got good examples to follow." Harrison smiled, though his eyes remained moist. "Better examples standing right here, son. Your generation. You understand. It's not just about standing guard, it's about standing for something." The palace guard sergeant had received messages from military units across Britain. Each one expressed the same sentiment, that Bennett's actions represented the highest traditions of service, that his support of Harrison embodied everything the guard stood for. "You know," Harrison said, gazing at the palace walls, "I worried sometimes about whether the younger generation understood, whether what we fought for still mattered." He turned slightly, meeting Bennett's eyes. "I don't worry anymore, Mary," Harrison was speaking with other military wives who had gathered, sharing stories of what it meant to love men who stood guard over freedom. James never talked much about his service, she told them. But this is what he always stood for, what he always believed in. The morning sun climbed higher, but no one moved to leave. They understood they were witnessing not just a moment of respect, but a living bridge between generations of service, where the old guard and the new stood together, upholding the values they had both sworn to protect. The palace command had made an unprecedented decision. Guard Bennett's post is to be marked, the order read. A permanent plaque will commemorate where one generation of guards upheld another. The king himself had approved the wording. On this spot, duty transcended ceremony, and tradition found its truest meaning. They'll probably have your stripes for this, Harrison said again, but now there was a smile in his voice. His strength had returned somewhat, supported by Bennett's unwavering presence and the dignity of the moment. Worth it, sir, Bennett replied quietly. Some things matter more than regulations. Your generation taught us that on beaches and battlefields far from here. The Royal Military Academy had sent word. The photograph of this moment would be displayed in their main hall. So future officers understand that leadership isn't just about following rules, the commandant's message read. It's about knowing which principles those rules serve. Harrison's grandson had moved closer, studying both men with intense concentration. Grandpa, he asked, is this why you always said the guard isn't just about standing still? Because sometimes you have to move to do what's right? The old soldier's eyes filled with pride. That's exactly right, son. Took me years to learn what this young man understands already. Sometimes the greatest honor lies in knowing when to break with ceremony. Military families in the crowd had begun sharing their own stories, tales of fathers, brothers, sons who had served. Each story seemed to add another layer of meaning to the scene before them. Two soldiers from different eras, bound by understanding deeper than protocol. You know what this reminds me of? An elderly woman spoke up, her voice carrying clearly. D-Day. When the boats reached the beach, the way those young men held each other up under fire, keeping each other standing through hell itself. Bennett felt the weight of those words, understanding that his support of Harrison wasn't just about one veteran's dignity. It was about honoring every soldier who had ever helped another stand tall in the face of adversity. The Palace Guard sergeant had received another message. The Guard's training program would be modified. Bennett's choice, they would call it. A lesson in understanding when humanity must transcend regulation, when the spirit of duty outweighs its letter. Tell me something, son. Harrison's voice had grown stronger, steadied by the respect being shown. What made you move? What made you decide that this was worth breaking protocol? Bennett's answer came from the heart of what service truly meant. Because, sir, every step you took under fire, every friend you lost, every battle you fought, it all led to this moment. And I couldn't let that legacy fall, not while I stood watch. 1 year later, a special ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. The stone where Bennett had supported Harrison now bore a simple bronze plaque, its words capturing what had transpired that morning. Here, 2 generations stood as one, proving that true tradition lives not in unwavering stance, but in unwavering heart. Harrison stood before it, straight and proud. His health had improved in the months following that day, as if the respect shown to him had rekindled something vital in his warrior's spirit. His grandson stood beside him, now enrolled in military school, inspired by what he had witnessed. Bennett was there too, still in his guard uniform, still perfect in his ceremonial bearing. But there was something different now in how tourists watched him. They saw not just a ceremonial figure, but a living embodiment of what service truly meant. You know what changed that day? Harrison addressed the gathered crowd, his voice strong and clear. Not just my ability to stand tall again. This young man reminded everyone what the Guard really represents. Not just ceremony, but the very heart of service itself. The king had commissioned a special medal, the Guard's Humanitarian Service Cross. Bennett was its first recipient, though he insisted the honor belonged more to Harrison than himself. I just held up what was already standing, he said at the ceremony. The strength was his. The courage was his. I just refused to let it fall. Military academies now taught the incident as part of their curriculum. Bennett's choice, they called it, the moment when a young guard had proven that sometimes the highest discipline lies in knowing when to break with protocol. My grandfather never talked much about his service before that day, Harrison's grandson told his fellow cadets. But afterward, he started sharing his stories about D-Day, about Korea, about what it really means to stand guard over what matters most. Mary Harrison had the original photograph framed in their home, the moment when her husband stood tall again, supported by a young guard who understood that some traditions run deeper than ceremony. James sleeps better now, she told friends. As if knowing his legacy is understood gives him peace. The palace guard room had been transformed. Alongside centuries of military honors hung children's drawings of that day, each one capturing in crayon and love the moment when tradition bowed to humanity and grew stronger for it. But perhaps the most profound change was visible in the daily changing of the guard. Each morning, as tourists gathered to watch the ceremony, parents would tell their children a different kind of story, not just about precision and protocol, but about the deeper strength that lies in understanding when to hold another up. And so they stood, the old guard and the new, their story now part of the palace itself. Each stone, each ceremony, each measured step carrying the lesson that true service isn't just about standing still, but about standing together, holding up not just our heroes, but the very values they fought to defend. Harrison's final words to Bennett that day became the unofficial motto of the King's Guard. Sometimes the greatest tribute we can pay to tradition is knowing when to let it bend, so that the spirit it protects may stand forever. The morning sun still traces shadows across those ancient palace stones, but they carry a different meaning now. Each ray of light seems to remind us that true strength often lies not in unwavering stance, but in unwavering heart. In the moments when we choose to hold each other up, to stand together, to remember that some traditions are best honored not by standing still, but by moving to uphold what matters most.